before Harry Potter ever received his Hogwarts letter, before he learned he was a wizard, before he even knew his own name meant something in the magical world, centuries of history had already unfolded. The world J.K. Rowling created didn't begin in 1991 when an 11-year-old boy boarded the Hogwarts Express. It stretches back through decades, centuries, even millennia of magical history that shaped everything we know about the wizarding world. Today, we're going to explore that hidden timeline, the events that set the stage for Harry's story, from the founding of Hogwarts itself to the night Voldemort fell at Godric's Hollow. Let's start at the very beginning, roughly 1,000 years ago, around 990 AD. This is when 4 of the greatest witches and wizards of the age came together with a revolutionary idea: to create a school where young magical people could learn to harness their powers safely and effectively. These 4 were Godric Gryffindor, Helga Hufflepuff, Rowena Ravenclaw, and Salazar Slytherin. Each founder valued different qualities in their students. Gryffindor prized bravery and chivalry. Ravenclaw sought intelligence and wit. Hufflepuff valued hard work, loyalty, and fair play. Slytherin looked for cunning, ambition, and pure magical bloodlines, and that last criterion would prove to be a problem. The founders worked together for years, building Hogwarts into the finest school of witchcraft and wizardry in Britain. But eventually, a bitter dispute arose between Slytherin and the other 3 founders. Slytherin believed that magical education should be kept within all magic families, that Muggleborns couldn't be trusted with magical secrets. The other founders disagreed fundamentally with this position. The disagreement became so severe that Slytherin eventually left the school he had helped create, but not before building the Chamber of Secrets deep beneath the castle, a hidden chamber that only his true heir could open, containing a monster meant to purge the school of those he deemed unworthy. Fast forward several centuries to the early 1900s, and we encounter a young man who would become perhaps the most influential wizard of the modern age: Albus Dumbledore, born in 1881. Dumbledore attended Hogwarts and quickly distinguished himself as the most brilliant student in living memory. But his early adult life was marked by tragedy and decisions that would haunt him forever. In the summer of 1899, Dumbledore met a young man named Gellert Grindelwald in Godric's Hollow. Grindelwald was visiting his great-aunt Bathilda Bagshot, the magical historian. The 2 brilliant young wizards formed an intense friendship, bonding over their shared fascination with the Deathly Hallows, 3 legendary magical objects that supposedly made their master invincible. Together, they began planning a revolution that would establish wizard rule over Muggles, ostensibly for the greater good. But this partnership ended in catastrophe. During a 3-way duel between Dumbledore, his brother Aberforth, and Grindelwald, Dumbledore's younger sister Ariana was killed. Dumbledore never knew whose spell actually struck her down, and this uncertainty tormented him for the rest of his life. Grindelwald fled Britain, and Dumbledore abandoned his dreams of power and the Deathly Hallows, choosing instead to remain at Hogwarts as a teacher. Meanwhile, Grindelwald went on to become one of the most dangerous dark wizards in history. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, he rose to power in Europe, stealing the Elder Wand from the wandmaker Gregorovitch and establishing a reign of terror. His followers committed atrocities across the continent, and his slogan for the greater good became a chilling rallying cry for wizard supremacy. The wizarding world eventually turned to the one person they believed could stop him: Albus Dumbledore. Despite his reluctance and the complicated history between them, Dumbledore finally confronted Grindelwald in 1945, the same year the Muggle Second World War ended, which was not coincidental. Their legendary duel is considered the greatest ever fought between 2 wizards. Dumbledore emerged victorious, Grindelwald was imprisoned in his own fortress of Nurmengard, and Dumbledore took possession of the Elder Wand, though he never spoke publicly about this. But even as one dark wizard fell, another was rising. Tom Marvolo Riddle was born on December 31st, 1926, in a Muggle orphanage in London. His mother, Merope Gaunt, was a witch from an ancient pure-blood family descended from Salazar Slytherin himself. She had used a love potion to ensnare Tom Riddle Sr., a wealthy Muggle, but when she stopped giving him the potion, hoping he would love her for herself, he abandoned her while she was pregnant. Merope died shortly after giving birth, naming her son after his father and her own father, Marvolo Gaunt. Tom Riddle grew up in that orphanage, aware from a young age that he was different. He could make things happen when he was angry or scared. He could move objects without touching them, make animals do what he wanted, make bad things happen to people who annoyed him. When Dumbledore came to the orphanage in 1938 to tell 11-year-old Tom about Hogwarts, he immediately recognized something disturbing in the boy. Tom had already discovered he could talk to snakes, had already used his powers to hurt other children, and showed no remorse for his actions. At Hogwarts, Tom Riddle was a model student, on the surface charming, brilliant, and ambitious. He was sorted into Slytherin, naturally, and quickly gathered followers. But behind this facade, he was researching the darkest magic, asking professors about Horcruxes, objects that could contain fragments of a soul, split through murder, granting a kind of immortality. He discovered he was the heir of Slytherin, opened the Chamber of Secrets, and unleashed the basilisk that killed a student named Myrtle Warren, who would become known as Moaning Myrtle. Riddle framed Rubeus Hagrid and his pet Acromantula for the death, getting Hagrid expelled while he himself received an award for special services to the school. After graduating in 1945, Riddle asked Dumbledore, now headmaster, for the position of defense against the dark arts teacher. Dumbledore refused, seeing through Riddle's facade. Riddle disappeared into the shadows, traveling the world, delving into the darkest corners of magic, and transforming himself through dark rituals into something barely human. When Tom Riddle returned to Britain years later, he was no longer recognizable. He had renamed himself Lord Voldemort, an anagram of his birth name, rejecting his Muggle father's legacy. He had created multiple Horcruxes, splitting his soul into 7 pieces. He had gathered followers, Death Eaters who believed in pure-blood supremacy and were willing to torture and kill for their cause. The 1970s saw the rise of Voldemort's first reign of terror. The magical community lived in constant fear. People disappeared, Muggles were murdered for sport, and anyone who opposed Voldemort was targeted. Entire families were wiped out. The Ministry of Magic seemed powerless to stop him. His followers infiltrated every level of magical society, and no one knew who to trust. Against this darkness, Dumbledore formed the Order of the Phoenix, a secret society dedicated to fighting Voldemort. Members included some of the bravest witches and wizards of the age: James and Lily Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, Frank and Alice Longbottom, Mad-Eye Moody, and many others. They fought a guerrilla war against the Death Eaters, working outside the Ministry's official channels. But in 1980, a prophecy was made. Sybil Trelawney, applying for the position of divination teacher at Hogwarts, fell into a genuine trance in front of Dumbledore. She spoke of a child born at the end of July to parents who had defied Voldemort 3 times, a child with power the Dark Lord knew not, who would have the power to vanquish him. This prophecy was partially overheard by Severus Snape, at that time a Death Eater and spy, who reported it to Voldemort. 2 children fit the prophecy's description: Neville Longbottom and Harry Potter, both born in late July 1980 to parents in the Order of the Phoenix. Voldemort chose Harry, perhaps because Harry was a half-blood like himself, rather than pureblood Neville. When Snape learned that Voldemort planned to target the Potters, specifically Lily Potter, the woman Snape had loved since childhood, he turned to Dumbledore in desperation, agreeing to work as a double agent in exchange for protection for the Potters. Dumbledore agreed but told Snape he should ask Voldemort to spare Lily's life as well. The Potters went into hiding under the Fidelius charm, with Peter Pettigrew as their secret keeper, a choice made at the last minute on Sirius Black's suggestion, as he thought he would be the obvious choice and that using Peter would throw Death Eaters off the trail. This decision proved catastrophic. Pettigrew was secretly a Death Eater and betrayed the Potters to Voldemort. On October 31, 1981, Voldemort arrived at the Potter house in Godric's Hollow. He killed James Potter first, who died trying to give his wife and son time to escape. He then found Lily shielding Harry in the nursery. Voldemort offered her a chance to stand aside, to live, keeping the promise Snape had begged of him. Lily refused again and again, pleading for her son's life, offering her own in his place. Voldemort killed her and then turned his wand on Harry Potter. But when Voldemort cast the killing curse at the 15-month-old child, something unprecedented happened. Lily's sacrifice, her choice to die protecting her son when she could have lived, created a powerful magical protection. The curse rebounded, destroying Voldemort's body and leaving only a fragment of his soul clinging to life. Harry survived with nothing but a lightning bolt scar on his forehead. The wizarding world erupted in celebration. The war was over. Voldemort was gone. And a baby boy who would remember nothing of that night had somehow done what the greatest wizards of the age could not. Hagrid retrieved Harry from the ruined house and delivered him to Dumbledore, who left the child on the doorstep of his Muggle aunt and uncle at number 4, Privet Drive, with nothing but a letter of explanation. 10 years would pass before Harry Potter learned the truth about who he was, what had happened that night, and the role he was destined to play in the wizarding world. But that, of course, is where the story we all know begins. But we've glossed over crucial details from that decade before Voldemort's fall, and understanding them is essential to grasping what Harry would later face. Let's go back and examine more closely the key players and events that shaped those dark years. James Potter and Lily Evans first met on the Hogwarts Express in 1971. Lily was Muggle-born, brilliant at potions and charms, and became friends with Severus Snape before either of them knew they were magical. Snape lived on Spinner's End in the same town as the Evans family, and he was the one who told Lily she was a witch. Their friendship was genuine and deep, at least initially, but it fractured over the years at Hogwarts. James Potter, meanwhile, came from an old pureblood family, wealthy and privileged. He was talented, particularly at Transfiguration, but also arrogant and often cruel, especially to Snape. Along with Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew, James formed the Marauders, a tight-knit group that became legendary for their mischief and rule-breaking. They created the Marauders Map, a magical document showing every person's location within Hogwarts, a remarkable feat of magic for students. The Marauders discovered in their second year that Lupin was a werewolf. Rather than shun him, James, Sirius, and Peter spent 3 years learning to become animagi, wizards who could transform into animals, so they could accompany Lupin during his transformations. This was illegal magic for underage wizards, requiring registration with the Ministry, but they did it anyway and never registered. James became a stag, Sirius a large black dog, and Peter a rat. The relationship between Snape and the Marauders was poisonous. Snape, brilliant but from a poor background with an abusive Muggle father, gravitated toward the dark arts and pure-blood supremacist students in Slytherin. James and Sirius, who came from wealth and privilege, targeted him relentlessly. The worst incident came in their 5th year when Snape tried to follow Lupin through the passage under the Whomping Willow on the night of a full moon. Sirius had told him how to get past the tree, essentially sending Snape to face a werewolf. James intervened at the last moment and saved Snape's life, but the damage to all their relationships was profound. That same year, Snape's friendship with Lily ended completely. After James had humiliated him publicly, levitating him upside down and exposing his underwear, Lily tried to defend Snape. In his rage and humiliation, Snape called her a mudblood, the most offensive term for Muggle-born wizards. Lily never forgave him, though he spent the rest of his life regretting those words. By their 7th year, James had matured considerably. He became head boy, stopped hexing people for fun, though according to Sirius he never stopped hexing Snape. Lily finally agreed to date him, and they fell deeply in love. They married soon after graduating in 1978, during the height of Voldemort's First War. Both joined the Order of the Phoenix immediately. Severus Snape, meanwhile, had taken the Dark Mark and become a Death Eater. His brilliance in potions and the dark arts made him valuable to Voldemort. He developed his own spells, including Levi Corpus, the very spell James had used to humiliate him, and the Dark Curse Sectum Sempra, designed to slash enemies as though with an invisible sword. The Order of the Phoenix operated from number 12, Grimmauld Place, the ancestral home of the Black family. Sirius Black had run away from home at 16, choosing to live with the Potters rather than remain with his pure-blood supremacist family. His younger brother, Regulus Arcturus Black, had taken the Dark Mark and become a Death Eater, following in the family tradition. But Regulus would later have a change of heart that cost him his life. He discovered one of Voldemort's Horcruxes and tried to destroy it, leaving a note signed R.A.B. for anyone who might find the locket. He was killed by the Inferi guarding it in 1979, though his sacrifice remained unknown for years. The war was brutal. Frank and Alice Longbottom were 2 of the Order's most accomplished fighters. The Pruitt brothers, Gideon and Fabian, who were Molly Weasley's brothers, died in combat, fighting 5 Death Eaters before they were killed. Marlene McKinnon and her entire family were murdered by Death Eaters. Dorcas Meadows was personally killed by Voldemort himself. Caradoc Dearborn disappeared and was never found. Edgar Bones and his family were wiped out. The Ministry's response was increasingly desperate. Barty Crouch Sr., head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, authorized the use of unforgivable curses against Death Eaters and instituted a policy of shoot-to-kill rather than capture. He sent his own son, Barty Crouch Jr., to Azkaban when the young man was caught as a Death Eater, showing no mercy even to his own family. Mad-Eye Moody, the most famous Auror of the age, filled half the cells in Azkaban during this period, though he always insisted on bringing Death Eaters in alive rather than killing them. Igor Karkaroff, who would later become headmaster of Durmstrang, was captured and tried. He bought his freedom by naming other Death Eaters, including Snape. But Dumbledore vouched for Snape at his trial, insisting that Snape had turned spy before Voldemort's fall and had provided invaluable intelligence at great personal risk. Dumbledore's word carried enormous weight, and Snape avoided Azkaban, though many in the magical community never fully trusted him. The Longbottoms weren't as fortunate as the Potters in the end. After Voldemort's fall, for Death Eaters Bellatrix and Rodolphus Lestrange, Rabaston Lestrange and Barty Crouch Jr. captured Frank and Alice Longbottom, torturing them with the Cruciatus Curse for information about Voldemort's whereabouts. They were tortured into insanity, leaving their son Neville to be raised by his grandmother. The 4 Death Eaters were given life sentences in Azkaban. Peter Pettigrew's betrayal had deeper roots than mere cowardice. Throughout the war, information kept leaking from the Order. Someone was passing secrets to Voldemort. Dumbledore never suspected Peter. Few did. Peter had always seemed the weakest of the Marauders, the least talented, the hanger-on. But he had been a Death Eater for at least a year before he betrayed the Potters, possibly longer. His ability to transform into a rat made him an ideal spy, able to overhear conversations unnoticed. After Voldemort's fall, Sirius Black immediately went after Peter, tracking him down in a Muggle street filled with witnesses. But Peter was clever. He shouted for everyone to hear that Sirius had betrayed the Potters, then cut off his own finger, blew apart the street with a curse behind his back that killed 12 Muggles, and transformed into a rat before escaping down a sewer. Sirius was left standing in the crater, laughing maniacally at the irony. He had suggested Peter as secret keeper, and now Peter had framed him perfectly. Sirius was arrested and sent to Azkaban without a trial. Barty Crouch Sr., still head of magical law enforcement and ruthless in his pursuit of Death Eaters, saw no need for one. Sirius had been the Potter's secret keeper as far as anyone knew, and he'd been caught at the scene of a massacre. Even Dumbledore believed Sirius guilty at first, though he later came to have doubts. Sirius would spend 12 years in Azkaban for crimes he didn't commit, while Peter Pettigrew lived as a rat in the Weasley family home. The night Hagrid delivered Harry to Privet Drive, 3 people were there. Dumbledore, Professor McGonagall, who had been watching the Dursleys all day in her cat form, and Hagrid himself, who arrived on Sirius's flying motorcycle. Sirius had lent it to him when he went after Peter. McGonagall protested leaving Harry with the Dursleys, calling them the worst sort of Muggles, but Dumbledore insisted. He had placed powerful protective enchantments on Harry, keyed to Lily's sacrifice and Petunia's blood relationship to her sister. As long as Harry called Privet Drive home, Voldemort couldn't touch him there. But Dumbledore made this decision knowing it would cost Harry his childhood. The Dursleys would hate Harry for what he represented, for the reminder that Petunia's sister had been special in ways she could never be. Yet Dumbledore calculated that a miserable childhood was preferable to Harry growing up famous in the wizarding world, potentially arrogant and spoiled, worshipped for something he couldn't remember and didn't understand. During those 10 years Harry spent in the cupboard under the stairs, the wizarding world slowly recovered. The Ministry tried to round up remaining Death Eaters. Some, like Lucius Malfoy, claimed they had been under the Imperius Curse, forced to serve Voldemort against their will. Malfoy's wealth and influence helped him avoid Azkaban. He made generous donations to various Ministry officials and St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies and injuries. His wife, Narcissa, was Sirius's cousin and Bellatrix Lestrange's sister, but she was never accused of being a Death Eater herself. Others disappeared entirely. Antonin Dolohov was caught and sent to Azkaban. Fenrir Greyback, the savage werewolf who bit Remus Lupin as a child and who enjoyed attacking children, went into hiding. Augustus Rookwood, who had infiltrated the Department of Mysteries, was captured. But many escaped justice, living quietly and pretending their past didn't exist. Dumbledore returned his focus to Hogwarts. He had refused the position of Minister for Magic multiple times, preferring to shape the future through educating young witches and wizards. He hired new teachers, including Professor Quirrell for Defense Against the Dark Arts in 1990. Though Quirrell had taught at Hogwarts before, he had taken a year off for practical experience fighting dark creatures. and he came back changed, nervous, wearing a turban. Snape remained at Hogwarts throughout this period, teaching potions in the dungeons and yearning for the defense against the dark arts position that Dumbledore never gave him. Dumbledore feared that the old jinx on the position, rumored to have been placed by Voldemort himself when he was refused the job, would force Snape to leave after a year, and Dumbledore needed Snape close. Snape's motivations were complex. Guilt over his role in Lily's death, genuine remorse for his past as a Death Eater, and a debt to Dumbledore for protecting him. The Weasley family grew during these years. Arthur and Molly Weasley had 7 children: Bill, Charlie, Percy, Fred and George, Ron, and finally Ginny, born in 1981, the same year as Harry. Arthur worked in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office at the Ministry, a relatively unimportant department that suited his genuine fascination with Muggle objects. The family was poor but loving, living in the Burrow, a ramshackle house held together as much by magic as by physical structure. Hermione Granger was born to Muggle dentists in 1979. She grew up not knowing she was a witch, though strange things happened around her when she was emotional. When her Hogwarts letter arrived, her parents were shocked but supportive, eager to help their daughter embrace this new world, even though it meant she would grow away from them in ways they couldn't fully understand. Neville Longbottom was raised by his formidable grandmother Augusta after his parents' torture. His family worried he might be a squib, a non-magical person born to magical parents, because his magic manifested slowly and weakly. His uncle Algy even dropped him out of a window once to try to shock some magic out of him. When Neville finally bounced down the garden and into the road, his family was relieved, but the pressure to live up to his parents' legacy weighed heavily on him. Draco Malfoy grew up at Malfoy Manor, taught from birth that pureblood wizards were superior to all others. His father filled his head with stories of the dark old days, carefully editing out the parts about serving Voldemort. Draco learned to look down on Muggle-borns, half-bloods, and anyone his father considered beneath them, which was nearly everyone. The magical creatures that would play roles in the coming years were also settling into their places during this decade. In the Forbidden Forest at Hogwarts, centaurs lived in their herds, reading the future in the stars. Aragog the Acromantula, whom Hagrid had raised from an egg and who had been blamed for the Chamber of Secrets opening, lived deep in the forest with his thousands of descendants. The Thestrals, skeletal winged horses visible only to those who had witnessed death, pulled the school carriages, though most students couldn't see them. Gringotts Bank continued its operations, run by goblins who had their own complex relationship with wizardkind. Goblin-made objects were treasured for their magical properties and their ability to imbibe only that which strengthened them, but wizard-goblin relations had historically been tense, marked by rebellions and mistrust. The goblins remembered their history differently than wizards did, and many harbored resentment over their treatment. The Dementors of Azkaban continued their grim work as prison guards, feeding on the happiness and hope of the prisoners. These dark creatures, born from decay and despair, could drain a person of every positive feeling, every good memory, leaving only the worst moments of their lives. The Ministry used them because they were effective and because they required no pay, but their presence on the island made Azkaban the most terrible prison in the magical world. Prolonged exposure to Dementors could drive prisoners insane, and many prisoners died there, lost to despair. House elves continued serving wizarding families, bound by magic and tradition. Dobby served the Malfoy family, forbidden to speak ill of them, forced to punish himself if he even tried. Winky served the Crouch family, devoted to them absolutely. Kreacher served the Black family at Grimmauld Place, though with Sirius in Azkaban, he answered only to Sirius's mother's portrait and maintained the house in its gloomy state. During these years, several crucial magical objects remained hidden or protected. The Philosopher's Stone, created by Nicholas Flamel, the only known maker of such an object, continued to produce the elixir of life that kept Flamel and his wife Perenelle alive for over 600 years. The stone could also turn any metal into pure gold, making it immensely valuable beyond its life-giving properties. Voldemort's Horcruxes lay hidden in their various locations. His diary, containing the memory of his 16-year-old self, remained wherever he had last placed it. The ring, which had belonged to Marvolo Gaunt and contained the Resurrection Stone, one of the Deathly Hallows, though Voldemort didn't know this, sat in the ruins of the Gaunt house. Helga Hufflepuff's cup was secured in Bellatrix Lestrange's vault at Gringotts. Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem remained hidden in the Room of Requirement at Hogwarts, where Voldemort had placed it during his job interview with Dumbledore years earlier. Salazar Slytherin's locket had been taken by Regulus Black, replaced with a fake, and eventually found its way to number 12, Grimmauld Place, where it sat unnoticed. And Nagini, who would become a Horcrux later, was perhaps already with the remnant of Voldemort in the Albanian forests. The seventh piece of Voldemort's soul, the piece he never meant to create, resided in Harry Potter himself, embedded in his scar when the killing curse rebounded. This created a connection between them that would manifest in strange ways: Harry's ability to speak Parseltongue, his connection to Voldemort's thoughts and emotions, even the pain in his scar when Voldemort was near or feeling strong emotion. The Deathly Hallows themselves had their own histories during this period. The Elder Wand rested in Dumbledore's possession, hidden in plain sight. He used it for his work at Hogwarts, though few knew it was the legendary Death Stick that had passed through so many hands, each owner taking it by force from the previous one. Dumbledore was perhaps the only wizard who had ever won the wand without killing for it. The Resurrection Stone remained in the Gaunt Ring, its true nature unknown even to Dumbledore, who understood what the Hallows were better than perhaps anyone alive. The Cloak of Invisibility, the only Hallow to pass freely from parent to child without weakening, had belonged to James Potter. On the night he died, he had lent it to Dumbledore, who was examining it. Dumbledore kept it for 10 years, studying it, before deciding to return it to James's son. The prophecy that had set everything in motion sat in the Department of Mysteries, stored in the Hall of Prophecy in a glass orb, labeled with Harry and Voldemort's names. Only the subjects of a prophecy could retrieve it from the shelves, a magical protection that meant Voldemort could never access it himself. The complete prophecy contained more than the portion Snape had overheard. It spoke of either Voldemort or Harry dying at the hand of the other, of a power the Dark Lord knew not, of the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord being born as the 7th month died. Sybil Trelawney herself had no memory of making the prophecy. She was the great-great-granddaughter of the famous seer Cassandra Trelawney, and while she seemed to be a fraud most of the time, surrounded by incense and making vague predictions, she had genuine sight buried deep within her. Dumbledore had hired her partly to protect her, knowing that if Voldemort ever returned, he would want to hear the complete prophecy. The structure of the Wizarding World's government during this recovery period deserves closer examination, as it would profoundly affect events to come. The Ministry of Magic, housed in London beneath street level, was divided into 7 departments, each playing crucial roles in magical society's reconstruction after Voldemort's first fall. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement was the largest and most important. Beyond the Orr Office, which employed wizards like Kingsley Shacklebolt and Nymphadora Tonks, it contained the Improper Use of Magic Office, which monitored underage wizards, and the International Statute of Secrecy. This department also housed the Wizardry Administration Services, the Wizardry being the High Court of Wizarding Law, where Dumbledore sat as Chief Warlock. After Barty Crouch Sr.'s fall from grace following his son's imprisonment, the ruthless approach to dark wizards softened somewhat, though the scars of the war remained. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes dealt with the aftermath of magical mishaps, including the Obliviator headquarters, where memory charms were coordinated to protect the Statute of Secrecy. These wizards worked constantly, modifying Muggle memories when magic was witnessed, cleaning up after magical accidents, and managing the occasional dragon sighting or giant rampage. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures was divided into 3 divisions: Beast, Being, and Spirit. This department's history was fraught with controversy, particularly regarding how creatures were classified. Centaurs and merepeople had refused being status because they didn't want to be categorized alongside hags and vampires, choosing beast classification instead as a form of protest. Werewolves were classified as beasts despite their human nature, a decision that deeply affected people like Remus Lupin. Lupin's life during Harry's childhood was particularly difficult. As a werewolf, he faced systematic discrimination that prevented him from holding steady employment. Every month, he transformed into a dangerous creature, and the prejudice against werewolves meant that few would hire him if they knew his condition. He lived in poverty, moving frequently, taking whatever work he could find and leaving before anyone discovered his secret. The Wolfsbane potion, which would allow werewolves to keep their minds during transformation, wasn't in common use yet. It was a recent invention, complex and expensive to brew. The circumstances of Lupin's condition went back to his childhood. Fenrir Greyback had bitten him when he was only 5 years old, as revenge against Lupin's father, who had insulted Greyback during a ministry meeting. Greyback positioned himself near a window the night before the full moon and attacked the child in his bed. Lyle Lupin, Remus's father, never forgave himself for the comment that had led to his son's curse. Dumbledore's decision to admit Remus to Hogwarts was unprecedented. No werewolf had been allowed to attend the school before. Dumbledore planted the Whomping Willow the year Remus started, and had a tunnel built from its roots to the Shrieking Shack in Hogsmeade. Each month, Madame Pomfrey would escort Remus through the tunnel, where he would transform in isolation. The sounds of the werewolf's anguish, for when alone, Remus would attack himself, having no other target, gave the Shrieking Shack its haunted reputation. The Department of International Magical Cooperation maintained Britain's relationships with other magical governments. This became increasingly important as the wizarding world was interconnected through various agreements and treaties. The International Confederation of Wizards, established in 1692 with the International Statute of Secrecy, continued to meet and address global magical concerns. Britain's representative was often someone from this department. Different countries had different approaches to magic education and government. Beauxbatons Academy of Magic in France, led by Madame Olympe Maxime, who was half-giant, though she tried to conceal this, taught students with a different emphasis than Hogwarts. Durmstrang Institute, located somewhere in the far north of Europe, taught the dark arts as part of its curriculum rather than merely defense against them. Igor Karkaroff had become its headmaster after purchasing his freedom by betraying fellow Death Eaters. The Magical Congress of the United States of America governed magic in America with stricter laws about magical Muggle fraternization than Britain maintained. The African magical schools, the Japanese magical community, the various magical governments across Asia and South America, all had their own traditions, their own approaches to the same fundamental questions about magic and secrecy. The International Statute of Secrecy remained the foundation of all these governments. Established in 1692 after centuries of witch burnings and persecution, it mandated that magical communities worldwide hide themselves from non-magical people. Violations could result in severe punishment, including imprisonment in Azkaban for British wizards. The Department of Magical Transportation oversaw various methods of magical travel, each with its own regulations and complications. The Floo network connected fireplaces across Britain, allowing wizards to travel by stepping into flames and speaking their destination clearly, though mispronunciation could lead to arrival at the wrong location, as Harry would discover. The network was monitored and could be shut down or tracked by the Ministry when necessary. Apparition, the ability to disappear from one location and reappear in another, required licensing. Wizards had to be 17 to take the test, and the skill was difficult to master. The danger of splinching, leaving part of oneself behind, made improper apparition potentially fatal. Anti-apparition charms could be placed on locations, which was why no one could apparate directly into Hogwarts, though Dumbledore had the power to lift these wards temporarily. Portkeys, ordinary objects enchanted to transport anyone touching them at a predetermined time, required ministry authorization to create, though dark wizards often made them illegally. The Portkey office tracked authorized portkeys carefully, as they could bypass many magical protections. Broomsticks remained the most common form of magical transportation for shorter distances. The evolution of racing brooms was a significant industry, with the Nimbus Racing Broom Company and the Comet Trading Company constantly competing for market dominance. The Nimbus 2000, released in 1991, represented the cutting edge of broom technology, until the Nimbus 2001 came out shortly after, purchased in bulk by Lucius Malfoy for the entire Slytherin Quidditch team to secure his son Draco's position as Seeker. The Night Bus, a triple-decker purple bus that transported stranded witches and wizards, operated throughout this period under the management of the Department of Magical Transportation. It could squeeze through impossible spaces and traveled at dangerous speeds, summoned by holding out a wand hand at the curb. Stan Shunpike worked as its conductor, collecting fares and helping passengers with their luggage. The Hogwarts Express, the Scarlet steam engine that transported students from King's Cross Station Platform 9 3/4 to Hogsmeade Station, ran its route every September 1st and brought students home each June. The barrier between platforms 9 and 10 at King's Cross served as the entrance to the platform, invisible to muggles, permeable to wizards. The train journey took most of a day, traveling north through the British countryside. The Department of Magical Games and Sports governed activities like Quidditch, which remained the most popular sport in the wizarding world. The British and Irish Quidditch League had 13 teams, including the Chudley Cannons, Ron Weasley's favorite team, despite their abysmal record, and the Vimborne Wasps. The Quidditch World Cup occurred every 4 years, drawing witches and wizards from around the globe. Quidditch itself had evolved over centuries from the crude game played on Quidditch Marsh in the 11th century. The addition of the golden snitch in the 13th century, replacing the golden snidget, a protected species since 1269, had fundamentally changed the game's strategy. The snitch was worth 150 points and ended the game when caught, making the seeker position crucial. The Department of Mysteries was perhaps the most secretive part of the ministry. Unspeakables worked there, studying the deepest mysteries of magic in complete silence about their work. Even their colleagues in other departments knew little about what happened behind the department's plain black door. Different chambers studied different phenomena. The Time Room housed the Ministry's collection of time turners, dangerous devices that allowed limited time travel. The Space Chamber studied spatial magic, The death chamber contained the ancient stone archway with its tattered veil, beyond which whispers could be heard, though what lay beyond, and whether anything did, remained unknown. The brain room studied thought and consciousness. The love chamber, the most important chamber, Dumbledore would later say, studied the most powerful magic of all, though few understood why love would be subject to such intensive study. And the Hall of Prophecy stored thousands of prophecies made over the centuries, each in a glass sphere, each labeled with the names of the subjects and the seer who made it. Time turners represented both incredible possibility and terrible danger. They allowed the user to travel backward in time, with the longest safe period being 5 hours. The Ministry kept them under careful guard, occasionally lending them for important purposes. The only known case of a student using one was when Hermione Granger would be given one to take extra classes. The dangers of time travel were severe. Wizards who had meddled too much with time had caused themselves to age rapidly or simply vanish from existence. The strict laws governing time-turner use reflected these dangers. The magical economy operated on a completely separate system from the Muggle world. Gringotts Bank, operated by goblins, had stood in Diagon Alley for centuries. The building itself was enchanted with countless protective spells and curses. Dragons guarded the deepest vaults, conditioned to expect burning and noise. The carts that traveled deeper underground moved through a labyrinth of passages that shifted and changed, making unauthorized access virtually impossible. The currency system used galleons, sickles, and nuts, with 17 sickles to a galleon and 29 nuts to a sickle. The exchange rate with Muggle money fluctuated, but a galleon was worth approximately £5 sterling during this period. The coins were magical. Galleons were made of gold, sickles of silver, and nuts of bronze, but they had anti-counterfeiting charms that made them impossible to duplicate magically. The wealth disparity in the wizarding world was stark. The Malfoys owned a manor and vault full of dark artifacts and gold stretching back generations. The Blacks, though many of the family were dead or imprisoned, had accumulated enormous wealth over centuries. The Potters had left Harry a vault full of gold. But families like the Weasleys struggled financially despite Arthur's ministry job. The cost of sending 7 children through Hogwarts, buying robes and books and wands, strained their resources constantly. Wands themselves were expensive and personal. Each wand chose its wizard, and the connection between wand and wizard was intimate and unique. Ollivander's, the wandmaker shop in Diagon Alley, had been selling wands since 382 BC, with each wand's history carefully recorded. Garrick Ollivander remembered every wand he'd ever sold, a feat of memory that suggested either magical enhancement or an extraordinary natural gift. He had sold Tom Riddle his wand 13.5 inches, Phoenix Feather Core. The phoenix whose feather resided in that wand had given only one other feather. The one in the wand Ollivander would sell to Harry Potter. The fact that the same phoenix provided both feathers created a connection between the wands that would manifest in unexpected ways. Wand lore was complex and not fully understood even by experts. Wands could switch allegiance, particularly in cases where a wizard was disarmed or defeated. The Elder Wand took this to an extreme. It was won only through combat, answering to strength. But ordinary wands were more subtle. A wand that was won might work for its new owner, though perhaps not as well as for its original master. A wand that was borrowed might function adequately. A wand that was inherited often worked well, as there was a blood connection. Different wand woods had different properties. Holly was protective and tended to choose wizards engaged in dangerous quests. Yew was associated with both life and death, often choosing wizards with power over life and death or those who would die heroically. Vine wands chose wizards with hidden depths and purposes. Hawthorn wands were suited to healing magic, but also to curses, making them conflicted and complex. The cores varied as well. Phoenix feather cores produced the greatest range of magic and were capable of the most spectacular effects, though they were the hardest to tame and personalize. Unicorn hair cores produced the most consistent magic and were least subject to fluctuations and blockages, though they were hardest to turn to the dark arts. Dragon heartstring cores produced powerful magic and learned most quickly, but were prone to accidents. The wizarding community's relationship with magical creatures during this period was complicated by centuries of conflict and cooperation. Dragons, classified by the ministry as a known wizard killer / impossible to train or domesticate, were nevertheless studied and even used. Dragon reserves existed in various countries. The Romanian Dragon Sanctuary, where Charlie Weasley worked, reserves in China, Peru, Australia, and elsewhere. These reserves protected both wizards from dragons and dragons from muggles. Different breeds had different characteristics. The Hungarian horntail was considered the most dangerous, with black scales and bronze horns, able to shoot fire over 50 feet. The Swedish shortsnout preferred to live in isolated mountains and had brilliant blue flames. The Chinese fireball was red and gold with a mushroom-shaped flame. The common Welsh green was the least troublesome, preferring to prey on sheep rather than humans. Giants had nearly been driven to extinction through war with wizards and their own violent internal conflicts. The few remaining giants lived in isolated mountain ranges, increasingly rare and increasingly violent. Rubeus Hagrid was half-giant. His mother was the giant Fridwulfa, who had left Hagrid's father when Hagrid was 3 to return to giant society. Hagrid's size and strength came from his giant heritage, though he was small for a giant and tall for a human, standing at 11.5 feet. The prejudice against giants was severe. Many wizards feared and hated them for the violence during Voldemort's first rise, when he had recruited giants to his cause and they had killed many wizards. This prejudice extended to half-giants, making Hagrid's position at Hogwarts somewhat unusual. Merpeople lived in communities beneath bodies of water around Britain and the world. Those in the Black Lake at Hogwarts were Selkies, though they preferred the term Merpeople. They had their own language, Mermish, which sounded like screeching above water but was intelligible below. They had their own society, their own laws, and wanted little to do with wizard affairs. Their classification as beasts rather than beings was a sore point, a decision they had made themselves but which reflected the complex politics of creature rights. Goblins maintained an uneasy peace with wizards, but their history was marked by rebellions and conflicts. The most famous goblin rebellions had occurred in the 17th and 18th centuries, driven by disputes over treasure, craftsmanship, and freedom. Goblins had different concepts of ownership than wizards. To a goblin, the creator of an item was its true owner, and that ownership never transferred even if the item was sold. When a wizard died, goblins believed goblin-made items should return to goblin ownership, a view that caused ongoing tension. The Sword of Gryffindor, goblin-made and impregnated with basilisk venom after Harry killed the basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets, exemplified this conflict. The sword had been made by the goblin Ragnuk the First for Godric Gryffindor over 1,000 years ago. From the goblin perspective, the sword was rented, not sold, and should have been returned upon Gryffindor's death. From the wizard perspective, Gryffindor had paid for the sword and it was rightfully his and his descendants or Hogwarts. Goblins were formidable with their own brand of magic, different from wizard magic. They could work metal in ways wizards couldn't, creating objects that absorbed only what made them stronger. House elves represented perhaps the most troubling aspect of wizarding society. These magical creatures were bound to serve wizarding families, enslaved by magic so deep and old that few questioned it. House elves had powerful magic. They could operate within Hogwarts where wizards couldn't, perform household magic without wands, and accomplish extraordinary feats. But this magic was channeled entirely into serving their masters. The enchantment binding house elves was such that they physically couldn't disobey direct orders from their masters, and they punished themselves severely for even thinking disloyal thoughts. They could only be freed if their master gave them clothes, a dismissal that most house elves considered the deepest shame. The psychological binding was as strong as the magical one. Most house elves wanted to serve, found purpose in it, and were horrified by the concept of freedom. Different families treated their house elves differently. The Malfoys abused Dobby, treating him as a servant to be kicked and ordered around. The Crouches kept Winky but showed her little affection, treating her service as expected rather than appreciated. At Hogwarts, over 100 house elves worked in the kitchens, cooking the feasts and maintaining the castle, invisible to students and rarely acknowledged. The history of house elf enslavement was lost to antiquity. No one knew when or how it started, whether elves had always been bound or if some ancient wizard had created the binding. What was clear was that centuries of magical servitude had shaped house elf society and psychology so profoundly that freedom itself had become foreign to them. The educational system at Hogwarts itself deserves deeper examination, as it shaped every witch and wizard who would play a role in the coming conflict. The school's curriculum had remained largely unchanged for centuries, teaching the same subjects that had been taught when the founders established it. Students took core classes in their first 5 years: Transfiguration, Charms, Potions, History of Magic, Defense against the Dark Arts, Astronomy, and Herbology. Flying lessons were mandatory in the first year for those who didn't already know how to fly. Professor Minerva McGonagall had been teaching Transfiguration at Hogwarts since 1956, having been a student there herself decades earlier. She was an animagus, registered with the Ministry, able to transform into a tabby cat with distinctive markings around the eyes that matched her glasses. Her strict demeanor concealed a deep care for her students and an unwavering loyalty to Dumbledore. She had fought in the First War against Voldemort as a member of the Order of the Phoenix, though she kept this largely private from her students. Professor Phileas Flitwick, the Charms professor, was part goblin, which contributed to his small stature. He had been a dueling champion in his youth, and his expertise in defensive magic and charms made him one of the most skilled wizards on the staff. Charms was perhaps the most versatile branch of magic. Everything from the summoning charm to the Patronus charm fell under its purview. Professor Pomona Sprout headed Hufflepuff House and taught herbology in the greenhouses. Her knowledge of magical plants was encyclopedic, covering everything from mandrakes, whose cries were fatal to those who heard them, and whose mature roots could restore those who had been petrified, to venomous tentacula, devil's snare, and countless other species both helpful and dangerous. Professor Binns, the history of magic teacher, had died years ago and continued teaching as a ghost, never having apparently noticed his own death. His lessons were notoriously dull, droning recitations of goblin rebellions and giant wars that put most students to sleep. Yet the history he taught was crucial. The goblin rebellions of 1612, 1642, and 1752 had shaped wizard-goblin relations. The giant wars had decimated the giant population. The witch burnings of the medieval period had led to the Statute of Secrecy. But few students absorbed these lessons through Binns's monotonous delivery. Professor Sinistra taught astronomy, requiring students to learn the names and movements of stars and planets. While this seemed abstract, astronomy had practical applications in potion-making and divination, where planetary alignments and star positions could affect magical outcomes. The tallest tower at Hogwarts was the Astronomy Tower, where students took their observations through telescopes at midnight. Madame Hooch taught flying and refereed Quidditch matches. She had been at Hogwarts for years, teaching generations of students how to summon a broom, mount it properly, and maneuver safely. Every year, at least a few students broke bones during flying lessons. Neville Longbottom would famously break his wrist in his first lesson, and this accident would inadvertently lead to Harry becoming the youngest Seeker in a century. The defense against the dark arts position had been cursed since Voldemort's failed attempt to secure it in the early 1970s. No teacher lasted more than a year. Some died, some went mad, some were exposed as frauds or criminals. The position's instability meant that students' education in defensive magic was inconsistent and often inadequate. Madame Pants, the librarian, guarded the library and its thousands of books with fierce possessiveness. The library contained texts on virtually every magical subject, though the restricted section required special permission to access. Books on the dark arts, dangerous curses, forbidden magic, and other perilous topics were kept there, available only to older students with signed permission slips from teachers, though determined students had been known to sneak in under invisibility cloaks or at night. Some books in the library were dangerous in themselves. The Monster Book of Monsters, required reading for care of magical creatures classes, would attack readers who didn't know to stroke its spine. Books on curses sometimes cursed their readers. A book on Horcruxes, Secrets of the Darkest Art, was so dangerous that Dumbledore eventually removed it from even the restricted section, though not before Tom Riddle had read it as a student. Madame Pomfrey ran the hospital wing with skill and efficiency, able to mend bones in seconds with Skeelgrow, though the process was excruciatingly painful, cure most magical ailments, and handle the steady stream of Quidditch injuries, potion accidents, and spell mishaps that characterized student life. She had been at Hogwarts long enough to have escorted Remus Lupin to the Whomping Willow monthly during his student years, keeping his secret faithfully. Argus Filch, the caretaker, was a squib born to magical parents but without magic himself. His resentment permeated everything he did. He prowled the corridors with his cat Mrs. Norris, hoping to catch students out of bed or breaking rules so he could punish them. He kept records of every student who had ever been disciplined, files stretching back decades. The house system itself created deep divisions within the school. Godric Gryffindor's house valued bravery, daring, nerve, and chivalry. Helga Hufflepuff's house valued hard work, dedication, patience, loyalty, and fair play. Rowena Ravenclaw's house valued intelligence, creativity, learning, and wit. Salazar Slytherin's house valued ambition, cunning, leadership, and resourcefulness, though it had become associated primarily with pureblood supremacy and dark wizards. The Sorting Hat, which had once belonged to Godric Gryffindor and been enchanted by all four founders, made the sorting decisions. It could see into students' minds, understand their qualities and potential, and place them where they would thrive or where they needed to be. The hat sometimes took the student's choice into account, as it would with Harry Potter. Sometimes it saw qualities the student themselves didn't recognize yet. The interhouse rivalry, especially between Gryffindor and Slytherin, was intense and often toxic. Slytherin House had produced more dark wizards than any other house, including Voldemort himself, which led to prejudice against Slytherins. Yet Slytherin also produced skilled, ambitious wizards who went on to important positions in the ministry, in business, in all areas of magical society. The house's reputation both reflected reality and perpetuated it. Students sorted into Slytherin found themselves meeting lowered expectations or fulfilling dark prophecies about their house's nature. Hufflepuff was often dismissed as the house for students who didn't fit elsewhere, lacking the obvious distinction of the other houses. Yet Hufflepuff had produced skilled wizards and witches, and the house's values of loyalty and hard work were arguably more important than raw talent or ambition. Quidditch at Hogwarts was more than just sport. It was a major source of house pride and competition. Each house had a team of 7 players. 3 chasers who scored by throwing the quaffle through hoops, 2 beaters who used bats to direct bludgers at opponents, 1 keeper who defended the hoops, and 1 seeker who caught the golden snitch. The house teams competed throughout the year for the Quidditch Cup, with matches drawing the entire school. The position of seeker required excellent vision, quick reflexes, and the ability to spot tiny details while flying at high speed. Seekers were often the lightest members of their teams. Weight affected broomstick speed and maneuverability. The snitch itself was enchanted with flesh memory, meaning it remembered the first person to touch it, which was relevant in disputed catches. Professional Quidditch differed slightly from the school game. Matches could last days or even weeks if the snitch wasn't caught, and the physicality could be brutal. The bludgers used in professional matches were faster and hit harder. The historical development of Quidditch had included periods where violence was not just accepted but encouraged. 500 fouls were listed in the official rulebook, all committed during the first Quidditch World Cup in 1473. The Hogwarts Library held Quidditch Through the Ages, written by Kenilworthy Wisp, which detailed the sport's complete history. The book was popular enough that copies were often vandalized or stolen, forcing Madame Pants to put extra protections on the library's copies. The school's physical structure was a marvel of magical architecture. The castle had been built and expanded over 1,000 years, with sections added by different generations of witches and wizards. Staircases moved, leading to different places on different days or at different times. Doors pretended to be solid walls until politely asked to open or tickled in the right spot. Some doors weren't doors at all but solid walls pretending. The Room of Requirement, located on the 7th floor opposite a tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy attempting to teach trolls ballet, appeared only when someone walked past 3 times thinking of what they needed. The room transformed itself to provide what was required, becoming a bathroom when someone desperately needed one, a hiding place for forbidden objects, a meeting room for secret organizations. Countless students over the centuries had discovered it and used it, then forgotten where it was. The Chamber of Secrets, built by Salazar Slytherin himself, lay deep beneath the castle, accessible through a bathroom sink in a girl's bathroom that had been out of order for decades, since Moaning Myrtle had been killed there in 1943. The entrance required speaking Parseltongue, the language of serpents, ensuring that only Slytherin's heir could open it. The chamber itself was enormous, lined with serpent sculptures, with the basilisk's lair at its heart. A basilisk was a giant serpent, bred from a chicken's egg hatched beneath a toad, capable of growing up to 50 feet in length and living for hundreds of years. The basilisk stare was instantly fatal to anyone who met its eyes directly, though seeing it through something else, a reflection, a ghost, a camera, merely petrified rather than killed. The Forbidden Forest bordered the castle grounds, a dangerous wilderness home to centaurs, acromantulas, unicorns, thestrals, and countless other creatures. Students were forbidden to enter without permission, though detention in the forest with Hagrid was not uncommon. The forest was ancient, with trees so thick in places that sunlight barely penetrated, and magic permeated every part of it. The centaurs who lived in the forest were intelligent beings with their own society and customs. They were skilled in astronomy, divination, healing, and archery. Their herd included Firenze, Bane, and Ronin, among others. Centaurs deeply resented being classified as beasts by the ministry and had little to do with wizarding society. They read omens in the stars and planets, though they rarely shared what they saw with wizards, whom they considered arrogant and blind to the bigger patterns of fate. Unicorns in the forest were beautiful and pure, their blood having powerful magical properties. Killing a unicorn was a terrible crime. The act of slaying something so pure and defenseless would curse the killer to a half-life, a cursed existence. Yet desperate individuals had killed unicorns to drink their blood, which would keep them alive even at death's door. The blood was silver blue and shone when spilled. Aragog's colony of acromantulas had grown to hundreds or thousands of spiders, each the size of a small elephant, all descendants of Aragog and his mate Mozag. Acromantulas were wizard-bred creatures, never naturally occurring, highly intelligent and capable of speech. They were classified as the same rating as dragons and basilisks. The colony made the deeper parts of the forest nearly impassable, as acromantulas considered anything smaller than themselves potential prey. The grounds of Hogwarts included the Black Lake, home to the Merepeople community, the giant squid, a mostly benign creature that occasionally helped students who fell into the water, and Grindylows, aggressive water demons with horns and sharp teeth. The lake was used for various purposes throughout the school year, from swimming to the occasional magical competition involving underwater retrieval tasks. Hogsmeade Village, the only all-wizarding settlement in Britain, was accessible to third-year students and above on certain weekends. The village had existed for centuries, founded around the same time as Hogwarts. It contained various shops and establishments: Honeyduke's Sweet Shop, Zonko's Joke Shop, the Three Broomsticks pub run by Madame Rosmerta, the Hog's Head, a less reputable pub frequented by unsavory characters, the Shrieking Shack, the post office, and various other businesses. The relationship between Hogsmeade and Hogwarts was symbiotic. The village depended on student business, and students cherished their Hogsmeade weekends as a taste of freedom. The tunnel from beneath the Whomping Willow emerged in the Shrieking Shack, though few knew of its existence. Other secret passages connected the castle to Hogsmeade, including one behind a statue of a one-eyed witch that led to Honeyduke's cellar, though these passages were supposedly known only to those who had the Marauder's map. The Marauder's map itself was a piece of extraordinarily advanced magic. Creating it required mastery of homunculus charms to track individuals, advanced transfiguration to create the interactive ink, powerful enchantments to prevent unauthorized users from reading it, and detailed knowledge of every secret passage and room in Hogwarts. The owls that carried mail in the wizarding world were more than simple postal workers. They were highly intelligent, capable of finding recipients anywhere without addresses, and able to navigate across countries and continents. The Hogwarts Owlery housed school owls available for student use, along with personal owls belonging to students wealthy enough to own them. Owl Post was more reliable than Muggle Post, as owls would find their recipients even if they'd moved or were traveling. Different owl species had different characteristics and values. Barn owls were excellent postal birds, reliable and fast. Snowy owls were beautiful and somewhat rare in Britain. Tawny owls were common and affordable. Screech owls were tiny and somewhat excitable. Eagle owls were large and impressive. The magical postal system also employed other birds occasionally, tropical birds for overseas delivery, even occasionally small owls for local deliveries. The Daily Prophet, the wizarding newspaper, was delivered by owl every morning. The paper was the primary news source for most British wizards, though its reporting was often sensationalist and its editorial stance tended to align with ministry positions. The Prophet's offices were in London, and it employed reporters like Rita Skeeter, who was secretly an unregistered animagus capable of transforming into a beetle, a form she used to eavesdrop on private conversations for her gossip columns. Other magical publications included Witch Weekly, a magazine focused on lifestyle and gossip, The Quibbler, run by Xenophilius Lovegood and known for conspiracy theories and unusual perspectives on magical events, and various specialized publications on topics like Transfiguration Today and Practical Potioneer. Diagon Alley itself was the heart of magical commerce in Britain. Hidden behind the Leaky Cauldron pub itself, invisible to muggles on Charing Cross Road in London, the alley could be accessed by tapping the correct brick in the wall behind the pub. The alley contained dozens of shops serving every magical need. Ollivander's for wands, Flourish and Blots for books, Madame Malkin's for robes, Elop's Owl Emporium, the Apothecary for potion ingredients, quality Quidditch supplies, and many others. Nocturne Alley branched off from Diagon Alley, a darker shopping district where items related to the dark arts were sold. Borgin and Burke's was the most prominent shop there, dealing in dark artifacts, cursed objects, and items of questionable legality. Tom Riddle had worked there for a time after leaving Hogwarts, using the position to track down items for his Horcruxes and to learn the locations of powerful magical objects he might steal. The Leaky Cauldron itself served as both a pub and an inn, a gateway between the Muggle and magical worlds. Tom the innkeeper had run it for years, providing rooms for wizards visiting London and serving drinks and simple meals. The pub existed in both worlds simultaneously. Muggles saw an abandoned storefront, while wizards saw the busy establishment. St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries was located in London, disguised as a department store to Muggles. The hospital treated everything from dragonpox to spell damage to lycanthropy. It was divided into different floors for different categories of injury and illness: creature-induced injuries, magical bugs and diseases, potion and plant poisoning, spell damage, and others. The treatment of magical ailments was a sophisticated field requiring both magical and medical knowledge. Healers wore lime green robes and specialized in different areas. Some injuries that would be serious or permanent for Muggles were trivial for magical healing. Broken bones could be mended instantly, though growing back bones that had been vanished took longer and was painful. Other conditions were uniquely magical and difficult or impossible to treat. Spell damage could be particularly complex. Curses could have lasting effects that resisted treatment. The Longbottoms remained in St. Mungo's long-term care ward, their minds destroyed by prolonged Cruciatus Curse exposure beyond what healing magic could repair. Mental damage from magic was often more permanent than physical injury. Dementor's effects, the removal of happiness and hope, eventually leading to the Dementor's kiss that sucked out the soul entirely, couldn't be healed. Someone who had been kissed remained alive but was essentially an empty shell, the soul gone beyond retrieval. This fate was considered worse than death by most wizards. Magical diseases were often highly contagious and dangerous. Dragonpox had killed Abraxas Malfoy, Draco's grandfather, and had epidemic outbreaks in history. Spattergroit was highly contagious with distinctive purple pustules. Scrofungulus caused unsightly fungal growths. Vanishing sickness caused the patient to occasionally turn invisible. These diseases and others kept the hospital's staff busy, though magical medicine had treatments for most common ailments. The magical creatures used in potion-making deserve closer examination, as the ingredients trade was a significant part of the magical economy and raised ethical questions that few wizards considered. Unicorn hair, which could be taken from a living unicorn without harm, was used in many potions and was a common wand core. But unicorn horn, which had powerful healing properties and could neutralize most poisons, required killing the unicorn to obtain, making it incredibly rare and expensive on the legal market, though more readily available through dark channels. Bezoar's stones taken from the stomach of goats were antidotes to most poisons and saved countless lives. They were standard equipment in potions classrooms and should have been in every wizard's emergency kit, though many wizards neglected this basic precaution. A bezoar had to be forced down the poisoned person's throat, and it worked almost immediately against common poisons. Dittany was an extremely powerful healing herb. When applied to wounds, it caused rapid healing and could prevent scarring. Essence of dittany could even help regrow skin tissue. The plant was difficult to cultivate and required careful handling, making it expensive but invaluable in any healer's bag. Acromantula venom was one of the most valuable potion ingredients, worth 100 galleons a pint. It was extraordinarily difficult to collect, given that it required approaching a colony of 18-foot spiders who considered humans prey. Few were brave or foolish enough to attempt collection, which drove the price even higher. The venom had various uses in advanced potion making, though specific applications were rarely discussed in standard texts. Potions themselves represented one of the most precise and unforgiving branches of magic. Unlike charms or transfiguration, where intent and willpower played major roles, potions required exact measurements, precise timing, and specific preparation techniques. A single mistake, adding an ingredient too early, stirring clockwise instead of counterclockwise, heating at the wrong temperature, could result in useless sludge at best or dangerous explosions at worst. Some potions were relatively simple. The cure for boils, taught to first years, required only 6 ingredients and basic preparation. Others, like polyjuice potion, were extraordinarily complex, requiring a month to brew and including ingredients like lacewing flies stewed for 21 days, leeches, fluxweed picked at the full moon, knotgrass, powdered bicorn horn, and shredded boomslang skin. The potion allowed the drinker to assume the appearance of another person for an hour, requiring a piece of the person to be transformed into, usually, hair. Veritaserum, the truth serum, was so powerful that 3 drops would cause the drinker to reveal their deepest secrets. It was colorless, odorless, and virtually undetectable, making it extremely dangerous. The ministry regulated its use strictly, and brewing it required a potion's master's skill. It took a full moon cycle to mature and required constant attention during brewing. Felix Felici's liquid luck made the drinker extraordinarily lucky for a period depending on the amount consumed. Everything they attempted would succeed. Spells would work perfectly. They would be in the right place at the right time. Opportunities would present themselves. But the potion was incredibly difficult to brew, taking 6 months, and had dangerous side effects if taken in excess, giddiness, recklessness, and dangerous overconfidence. The use of Felix Felici's was banned in organized competitions, sporting events, and examinations. A wizard who used it during a Quidditch match or during OWLS would be disqualified and possibly prosecuted. The potion's rarity and difficulty meant most wizards never experienced it, knowing it only from stories and advanced textbooks. Amortentia was the most powerful love potion in existence, recognizable by its mother-of-pearl sheen and distinctive steam rising in spirals. It didn't create actual love. That was impossible, as Dumbledore noted, but rather obsessive infatuation. Different people smelled different things in Amortentia based on what attracted them. The potion's effects wore off over time, requiring regular doses to maintain the infatuation, which was how Merope Gaunt had kept Tom Riddle Sr. under her control. Love potions in general were surprisingly common and legal, despite the ethical implications of magically compelling attraction. Weaker versions were sold openly, treated as harmless fun rather than the violation they represented. The magical world's casual attitude toward love potions revealed a troubling blindness to consent issues, particularly as the potions were primarily marketed to and used by young witches. Wolfsbane potion was a recent invention by Damocles Belby, developed sometime in the late 1970s. When taken correctly, a cup every day for a week before the full moon, it allowed a werewolf to keep their mind during transformation, becoming a harmless wolf rather than a murderous beast. However, the potion was extremely complex to brew, requiring a potion's master's skill, and was prohibitively expensive for most werewolves like Remus Lupin. The regulation of potions ingredients and the potions trade was handled by the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, though some argued it should fall under magical law enforcement given the dangerous nature of many substances. Certain ingredients were restricted or banned outright. You couldn't simply walk into the apothecary in Diagon Alley and purchase basilisk venom or acromantula venom without special permits and documented legitimate research purposes. The black market for potion ingredients was substantial. Nocturne alley shops dealt in restricted ingredients, and smuggling operations brought in materials from around the world. Boomslang skin, for instance, while not technically illegal, was expensive and controlled, making it a target for theft, as Hermione Granger would demonstrate by stealing some from Snape's private stores. The development of new potions continued throughout the wizarding world, though at a slow pace. Potions research required funding, time, and a master's expertise, which limited innovation. The medieval and early modern periods had seen more rapid development, with witches and wizards experimenting freely, sometimes with disastrous results. Modern regulations made research more difficult but also safer. Brewing potions was taught at Hogwarts from first year through NEWT level, though many students never progressed beyond basic competency. Snape's teaching style intimidating, harsh, and heavily favoring Slytherin students probably stunted many students' development in the subject. A talented student like Hermione excelled despite his hostility, but others gave up or developed phobias around potions' work. The ordinary wizarding levels, or OWLS, taken at the end of 5th year, determined which subject students could continue studying. Each subject was examined both practically and theoretically, and students received grades from outstanding down through exceeds expectations, acceptable, poor, dreadful, to troll. To continue a subject to NEWT level, students generally needed at least an exceeds expectations, though some professors accepted acceptable. The nastily exhausting wizarding tests, or NEWTS, taken at the end of 7th year, were considerably more difficult and determined career options. Aurors, for instance, required at least 5 NEWTS with grades of exceeds expectations or higher, including defense against the dark arts, transfiguration, potions, and charms. Healers needed similar high-level qualifications, particularly in potions, transfiguration, and herbology. The examination process itself was conducted by the Wizarding Examinations Authority, with examiners traveling to schools to administer practical tests. Griselda Marchbanks, who had examined Dumbledore himself in his student days, was on the board. The examiners were generally stern but fair, though the pressure of the exams caused many students enormous stress. Some students developed magical ailments from the anxiety, and the use of cheering charms was common during exam season. Career options for young witches and wizards were surprisingly limited compared to the Muggle world. The Ministry employed a significant percentage of the magical workforce across its various departments. Teaching positions at Hogwarts and the few other magical schools were scarce and rarely opened up. Healers at St. Mungo's were always needed but required extensive training. Shop owners in Diagon Alley and other magical shopping areas passed businesses down through families. Some wizards worked with muggles, maintaining the statute of secrecy while earning muggle money, though this was complicated and required careful memory charm work. Others worked in magical trades: broom makers, wand makers, robe makers, potion suppliers. The magical menagerie supplied magical pets. The quality Quidditch supplies shop specialized in sporting equipment. Each niche supported small numbers of specialists. Professional Quidditch players earned substantial salaries if they played for one of the league teams, though only a tiny percentage of wizards possessed the necessary skill. The 13 teams of the British and Irish Quidditch League each had 7 positions, meaning only 91 professional spots existed in Britain, though international leagues provided more opportunities. The Aura program was highly selective, accepting only the most talented applicants who passed rigorous background checks, aptitude tests, and a 3-year training program. Aurors learned to track dark wizards, counter dark magic, work undercover, and fight in lethal combat. The work was dangerous. Many Aurors died in the line of duty, particularly during Voldemort's first rise when they were outmatched and outnumbered. Cursebreakers, like Bill Weasley, who worked for Gringotts, dealt with magical protections on ancient tombs and treasure. The work required skill in multiple magical disciplines: charms, transfiguration, defense, ancient runes, and often took cursebreakers to exotic locations around the world. The danger was substantial, as ancient curses could be lethal and unpredictable. The study of ancient runes was an elective subject at Hogwarts starting in 3rd year, and it opened career paths in curse-breaking, magical research, and spell development. Runes were an ancient form of magic, symbols that held power in themselves. Runespell work was slower than wand magic but often more permanent. The protections on Gringotts, for instance, included extensive rune work that had been maintained and updated for centuries. Arithmancy, another elective, used complex numerical charts to predict the future and analyze magical properties. It was considered one of the most intellectually demanding subjects at Hogwarts, essentially a highly complex branch of mathematics that revealed underlying magical patterns. Career opportunities in arithmancy were limited but highly paid. The few masters of the subject were often employed in spell development, creating entirely new magic by analyzing numerical patterns. Care of magical creatures became an elective in 3rd year, though the subject's quality depended heavily on the professor. Under Rubeus Hagrid, who would eventually take over the position, the curriculum would focus heavily on dangerous creatures, often at inappropriate difficulty levels for the students. A more traditional approach emphasized creature classification, proper handling techniques, and the care of common magical creatures like hippogriffs, bowtruckles, and nifflers. Divination, taught by Professor Trelawney in the North Tower, was perhaps the most controversial subject at Hogwarts. Most forms of divination, reading tea leaves, crystal balls, palmistry, dream interpretation, were imprecise at best and often completely useless. Yet true seers did exist, though they were extraordinarily rare. Trelawney herself was descended from a genuine seer and had made at least 2 true prophecies in her life, though she would never remember making them. The difference between true prophecy and fortune-telling was profound. True prophecies were rare, genuine glimpses of possible futures, though even true prophecies were subject to interpretation and the self-fulfilling nature of trying to prevent them, as Voldemort would demonstrate by attacking Harry based on a prophecy, thereby creating the very circumstances that marked Harry as his equal. Most divination was symbolic interpretation rather than genuine prophecy. The inner eye, as Trelawney called it, was supposedly the ability to see beyond the mundane into deeper meanings and patterns. In practice, most divination students learned to make vague predictions that could apply to almost anyone and to interpret their tea leaves or crystal balls creatively. The subject was almost impossible to fail, as any prediction could be defended as symbolically true. Yet there was genuine magic in some forms of prediction. Centaurs studied the movement of planets and stars, finding meaning in celestial patterns that human wizards generally missed. Their astronomy was deeper and more accurate than what was taught at Hogwarts, though they rarely shared their knowledge with wizards whom they considered too arrogant to understand. The magical education system's gaps were significant. Students learned virtually nothing about magical history beyond Binns's boring lectures about goblin rebellions. They learned little about the Muggle world. Muggle studies was an elective, often taken only by Muggle-born students who already knew its content. Political education was non-existent. Students graduated knowing how to transfigure teacups into rats, but often understanding little about the society they were entering. The social stratification in magical Britain extended beyond blood status. Wealthy families like the Malfoys wielded enormous influence through their money and connections. Poor families like the Weasleys struggled despite Arthur's steady ministry employment. The magical world lacked social mobility programs. There were no scholarships mentioned for Hogwarts, no assistance for families who couldn't afford school supplies, though the school itself appeared to be free to attend. Orphans in the magical world, like Tom Riddle or Harry Potter, were placed with Muggle relatives when possible or ended up in Muggle orphanages. As there was no magical child welfare system mentioned, the assumption seemed to be that magical children would always have magical relatives willing to take them in, which was demonstrably false. The treatment of squibs, non-magical people born to magical parents, revealed another form of discrimination. Squibs like Argus Filch or Arabella Figg existed on the margins of magical society, unable to perform magic but too connected to the magical world to integrate fully into Muggle society. Most squibs were hidden away, their existence an embarrassment to their families. The magical world made no accommodations for them, no way for them to participate in magical society beyond menial positions. Blood status politics had shaped magical Britain for centuries. The Sacred 28, listed in the Pureblood Directory published in the 1930s, were families that the author Cantankerous not declared had maintained pure blood status without any Muggle contamination. The list included the Blacks, Malfoys, Lestranges, Longbottoms, Weasleys, and others, though some families like the Potters were excluded despite being pureblood because they accepted half-bloods and Muggleborns too readily. Many pureblood families had died out through inbreeding and refusing to marry half-bloods or Muggleborns. The Gaunts were the most extreme example. Marvolo Gaunt and his children Morphin and Merope lived in squalor, so obsessed with blood purity and their descent from Salazar Slytherin that they refused to marry beneath them. Marvolo was violent and abusive. Morphin inherited his father's worst qualities and ended up in Azkaban for attacking Muggles. And Merope was beaten down and powerless until she escaped by using a love potion on Tom Riddle Sr. The Black family tapestry at Grimmauld Place showed the results of this obsession: burn marks where family members who married Muggles or Muggleborns had been blasted off, representing disownment. Sirius's mother Walburga Black had burned him off when he ran away. His cousin Andromeda Tonks, mother of Nymphadora, had been burned off for marrying Muggle-born Ted Tonks. The family tree showed extensive intermarriage between pureblood families, Blacks marrying other Blacks, connections to every major pureblood family. The irony was that pureblood ideology was based on a fiction. Every wizarding family had Muggle ancestors if you went back far enough. Magic appeared spontaneously in Muggle families, creating Muggle-born witches and wizards, which proved that magical ability wasn't purely hereditary in the way pureblood ideologists claimed. The evidence suggested that magic was more random, appearing in some family lines and not others, but not following simple genetic patterns. Muggle-born witches and wizards often matched or exceeded purebloods in magical ability. Hermione Granger would prove to be the most talented witch in her year. Lily Potter had been exceptional at potions and charms. The idea that pureblood wizards were inherently more powerful was demonstrably false, yet the prejudice persisted. Half-blood wizards, those with one magical parent and one Muggle or Muggle-born parent, were the majority of the magical population, though exact statistics were never given. This included many prominent wizards. Voldemort himself was half-blood, as was Snape, as was Harry. The term half-blood was less stigmatized than mudblood, though pureblood extremists still considered half-bloods inferior. The slur mudblood was considered the most offensive term in the wizarding world, essentially a magical racial slur. Its use was shocking even to many who held prejudiced views. When Draco Malfoy would call Hermione a mudblood, Ron Weasley's reaction, trying to curse Draco, reflected how severe the insult was, even to someone from a relatively poor family like the Weasleys, who themselves faced class discrimination from wealthy purebloods. The connection between blood purity ideology and dark magic was strong but not absolute. Many dark wizards came from pureblood families and espoused pureblood supremacy, but not all purebloods were dark wizards, and not all dark wizards were purebloods. The Weasleys were pureblood but firmly opposed to blood purity ideology. Conversely, Voldemort was half-blood but obsessed with pureblood supremacy, rejecting his Muggle heritage completely. The Death Eater's ideology mixed pureblood supremacy with worship of power and contempt for weakness. They targeted Muggle-borns for persecution and murder, but they also targeted blood traitors, purebloods who defended Muggle rights or married Muggles. The Weasleys were considered blood traitors, as were the Longbottoms. Being pureblood offered no protection if you opposed Voldemort's ideology. The unforgivable curses, the Killing Curse, the Cruciatus Curse, and the Imperius Curse were called unforgivable because their use on humans carried an automatic life sentence in Azkaban. Each curse required powerful magic and murderous intent. You couldn't accidentally cast an unforgivable curse. You had to mean it, had to truly want to cause pain or death or control. The Killing Curse, Avada Kedavra, produced a flash of green light and caused instant death with no physical damage to the body. There was no counter-curse, no blocking it. The only defense was physical cover or a counter-sacrifice like Lily Potter's. The curse required genuine murderous intent, wanting someone dead with your whole being. Most wizards couldn't cast it even if they tried, lacking the darkness necessary. The Cruciatus Curse, Crucio, caused excruciating pain without physical injury. The victim felt as though their bones were on fire, their head splitting apart. Prolonged exposure could cause permanent insanity, as the Longbottoms demonstrated. Like the Killing Curse, Crucio required genuine desire to cause pain. You had to enjoy the victim's suffering for the curse to work properly. Bellatrix Lestrange was particularly skilled with it, as her sadism powered the curse effectively. The Imperius Curse, Imperio, placed the victim under the caster's complete control. The victim would obey any command, unable to resist. A strong-willed individual could fight the curse, but most people succumbed completely. The curse had been widely abused during Voldemort's first rise, with many Death Eaters claiming after his fall that they had been under Imperius rather than acting voluntarily. The legal system's handling of the Imperius Curse defense revealed significant problems. Some Death Eaters genuinely had been forced to serve Voldemort under Imperius. They were victims themselves. But others lied, claiming they had been controlled when they had served willingly. The ministry had difficulty distinguishing between true victims and liars, particularly when wealthy families like the Malfoys could afford the best lawyers and had political connections. The use of Veritaserum in interrogations was controversial and legally restricted. The ministry couldn't force suspects to take Veritaserum without their consent except under specific circumstances, and even then, skilled occlumens could resist the potion. Some argued that all Death Eaters should have been forced to take Veritaserum during trials, which would have revealed who had truly been under Imperius and who was lying. The political implications of such a policy apparently outweighed the pursuit of justice. Barty Crouch Sr.'s authorization of unforgivable curses against Death Eaters during the war had been controversial. Allowing Aurors to use killing curses, to torture suspects with Crucio, or to control them with Imperio essentially meant fighting darkness with darkness. Some argued this was necessary, that you couldn't fight dark wizards while handicapped by rules they ignored. Others believed it corrupted the Aurors and undermined the moral foundation of their cause. The descent into this moral gray area was gradual. At first, the ministry authorized killing curses only in self-defense. Then in cases where capture was impossible. Then preemptively against known Death Eaters. Each step seemed justified by the previous one, by the mounting casualties, by the desperation of losing the war. Azkaban prison's use of Dementors as guards represented another moral failure of the magical justice system. The constant presence of Dementors meant that all prisoners, guilty or innocent, were subjected to psychological torture. They were forced to relive their worst memories continuously, stripped of all positive feelings. This treatment would have been considered cruel and unusual punishment in any civilized legal system, yet the magical world accepted it as normal for over 200 years. The fact that Sirius Black spent 12 years in Azkaban without a trial exposed another systemic failure. The post-war period had seen numerous prisoners sent to Azkaban based on minimal evidence or simply on suspicion. Barty Crouch Sr. had prioritized swift punishment over due process. The Wisengamot, which should have served as a check on such abuses, had been too frightened and angry to insist on proper trials for all accused. The long-term effects of Azkaban on prisoners who were eventually released were severe. Even after leaving, former prisoners suffered from depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress from the Dementor exposure. They had difficulty reintegrating into society, often suffering flashbacks and emotional numbness. Yet there was no support system for released prisoners, no therapy or rehabilitation programs mentioned. They were simply released and expected to function normally. Magical medicine's inability or unwillingness to address mental health issues was striking. St. Mungo's had a ward for permanent spell damage victims like the Longbottoms, but no mention was made of treatment for depression, anxiety, trauma, or other mental health conditions that would have been common in post-war magical society. The absence of psychological support was particularly notable given how many witches and wizards would have been traumatized by the war. Order of the Phoenix members had witnessed friends tortured and killed. Aurors had fought Death Eaters and seen colleagues die. Families had lost loved ones. Children had been orphaned. Yet the magical world seemed to expect everyone to simply carry on without addressing the psychological wounds. This lack of mental health support may have contributed to the magical world's inability to process what had happened. Rather than confronting the social problems that had enabled Voldemort's rise, the blood purity ideology, the economic inequality, the political corruption, the magical community seemed to collectively pretend that Voldemort had been an aberration, a unique evil that wouldn't return. They went back to their old prejudices and problems as if nothing had changed. The celebration of Harry Potter as the boy who lived while ignoring the infant's actual needs exemplified this dysfunction. Harry became a symbol, a reassurance that the danger was past, rather than a child who needed care and protection. The magical world was so eager to believe they were safe that they didn't question what happened to the orphaned hero or whether he was being properly cared for. Dumbledore's decision to leave Harry with the Dursleys, while strategically sound from a security perspective, meant that Harry grew up abused and neglected, with no knowledge of his heritage or his parents' sacrifice. The magical world's savior spent his childhood in a cupboard, unloved and unwanted, while wizards celebrated his name without knowing or caring about his actual life. The decade Harry spent at Privet Drive was marked by systematic emotional abuse and neglect that would have lasting psychological effects. Vernon and Petunia Dursley treated their nephew as a burden and an embarrassment, forcing him to live in the cupboard under the stairs while their son Dudley had 2 bedrooms. Harry was given Dudley's broken toys and cast-off clothes that were far too large for him. He was forced to do household chores while Dudley was pampered and spoiled beyond reason. The Dursleys told Harry his parents had died in a car crash, that they were drunken layabouts who were a burden on society. They tried to stamp out any sign of magic in Harry to make him normal, punishing him severely whenever strange things happened around him, things he couldn't control or understand. When Harry made the glass vanish at the zoo, allowing a python to escape, the Dursleys locked him in his cupboard for weeks. Dudley and his gang made Harry's school life miserable. Harry hunting was Dudley's favorite sport, chasing Harry around the neighborhood with his friends. Teachers at Harry's primary school seemed to notice nothing amiss, or perhaps they simply didn't want to see. Harry learned to make himself invisible, to stay out of the way, to expect nothing and want nothing. These survival mechanisms would shape his personality in ways that would take years to unpack. Yet the magical world did have someone watching over Harry, though at a distance. Arabella Figg, a squib who lived on Wisteria Walk, was placed there by Dumbledore to keep an eye on Harry. She couldn't do magic, couldn't intervene directly, but she could report if anything went seriously wrong. Her house full of cats and boring photograph albums were a cover for her real purpose. Dumbledore received regular reports on Harry's welfare, though what those reports contained and how honestly they portrayed the Dursleys' treatment of Harry remained unclear. Dumbledore knew the Dursleys were not kind people. McGonagall had warned him the night he left Harry there. Whether he knew the full extent of the neglect and abuse, and what he would have done differently if he had, were questions that would haunt the choices he made. The protection Lily's sacrifice provided was real and powerful. As long as Harry could call Privet Drive home, as long as he lived with his mother's blood relative, Voldemort's followers couldn't touch him there. The protection extended beyond the physical house to the general area where Harry lived. This magical protection required that Harry return to Privet Drive at least once a year to maintain it, which explained why Dumbledore insisted Harry go back every summer despite the terrible environment. But Dumbledore's calculations about what Harry needed for his eventual confrontation with Voldemort went deeper than physical protection. He believed that growing up away from fame, not knowing he was special, would prevent Harry from becoming arrogant or self-important. A boy raised as the wizarding world's savior might become insufferable, might believe himself above others, might make decisions based on his celebrity rather than wisdom. Whether this justified condemning Harry to a childhood of abuse was a moral question Dumbledore struggled with himself. He chose what he believed was the greater good, a humble, kind Harry who would be willing to sacrifice himself when necessary, rather than a famous, spoiled Harry who might refuse. It was a cold calculation that treated Harry as a weapon to be forged rather than a child to be protected. During these years, Several key figures prepared for what they believed or feared might come. Dumbledore never quite believed Voldemort was truly gone. The evidence suggested otherwise. Voldemort had created Horcruxes, which meant he couldn't die while those objects remained intact. Dumbledore spent years researching Horcruxes, a branch of magic so dark that information was deliberately obscured even in the restricted section. Horcrux creation required splitting one's soul through murder, then performing a dark ritual to encase the fragment in an object. The process was described as the most terrible of all dark magic. A wizard with a split soul was less than human, damaged in fundamental ways. Creating multiple Horcruxes, which Dumbledore suspected Voldemort had done, meant splitting the soul into pieces so small that the person's humanity was essentially destroyed. Dumbledore began searching for information about Tom Riddle's life, trying to understand what objects Voldemort might have chosen for his Horcruxes. He tracked down people who had known Riddle at different stages, former professors, people Riddle had worked with, anyone who might provide insight. He examined records of murders committed around times when Riddle might have created Horcruxes. He researched the founders of Hogwarts and their artifacts, suspecting Voldemort's obsession with Hogwarts history. This research took years and was conducted in absolute secrecy. Dumbledore told no one what he was searching for, as knowledge of Horcruxes was dangerous in itself. Even learning that such magic was possible might tempt someone to attempt it. The very fact that Voldemort had created Horcruxes could never be widely known, as it would cause panic and despair. How do you defeat an enemy who literally cannot die? Severus Snape remained at Hogwarts throughout this decade, teaching potions with a bitterness that infected his every interaction with students. His position was complicated. He had been a Death Eater, had turned spy, had survived by playing both sides. Many in the wizarding world still distrusted him, suspecting his conversion had been expedient rather than genuine. Only Dumbledore's unwavering support kept him at Hogwarts. Snape's motivations were complex and contradictory. His guilt over Lily's death was genuine and consuming. He had brought the prophecy to Voldemort, had caused Voldemort to target the Potters, had been responsible, however indirectly, for the death of the only person he had ever loved. This guilt drove him to serve Dumbledore, to protect Lily's son, to work against the Death Eaters he had once called brothers. Yet Snape's other feelings were less noble. His hatred for James Potter extended to James's son, even as he worked to protect Harry. He saw James in Harry's appearance, his casual confidence, his rule-breaking. Snape couldn't separate his loathing for the father from his obligation to the son. He protected Harry because Dumbledore required it, because Lily would have wanted it, but he did so without kindness or warmth. Snape's skill in occlumency, the magical defense of the mind against external penetration, was extraordinary. This skill was essential for a double agent, allowing him to hide his true thoughts and loyalties. He had mastered occlumency to the point where even Voldemort couldn't penetrate his mind, couldn't see the deception. This required iron control, perfect mental discipline, and the ability to feel contradictory emotions simultaneously without revealing the contradiction. Remus Lupin spent these years in poverty and isolation, moving from job to job, hiding his condition. The discrimination against werewolves made stable employment nearly impossible. Employers who learned he was a werewolf would dismiss him immediately, fearing the danger he represented or simply succumbing to prejudice. Lupin survived on odd jobs, temporary work, and occasional help from Dumbledore. The loneliness was perhaps worse than the poverty. The Marauders had been Lupin's family, and 3 of them were gone: James dead, Sirius imprisoned, Peter supposedly dead but actually hiding as a rat. Lupin had no one who understood him, no one he could talk to honestly. He believed Sirius had betrayed the Potters, which meant his trust in his oldest friends had been shattered. The isolation fed his self-loathing, his belief that he was a monster unworthy of friendship or love. Hagrid remained at Hogwarts as keeper of keys and grounds, living in his wooden hut on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. He was one of the few who maintained absolute certainty of Sirius's guilt, as he had been there the night Sirius supposedly betrayed the Potters. Hagrid had taken Harry from the ruined house in Godric's Hollow, had flown him on Sirius's motorcycle to Privet Drive, had seen the aftermath of Peter's supposed murder of 12 Muggles. Hagrid's love for dangerous creatures continued unabated. He maintained his flock of hippogriffs, attempted to raise various dangerous animals in secret, and spent considerable time in the Forbidden Forest with its dangerous inhabitants. His inability to recognize that not everyone shared his affection for creatures that could kill them would later cause problems when he became a teacher. The Weasley family grew and evolved during this decade. Bill finished Hogwarts and took a job as a cursebreaker for Gringotts, eventually transferring to Egypt to work on ancient tombs. Charlie followed him through Hogwarts and joined the Romanian Dragon Sanctuary, fulfilling his dream of working with dragons. Percy became a prefect and then head boy, ambitious and rule-following in ways that set him apart from his brothers. Fred and George developed their talent for pranks and invention, creating joke items and testing them on willing and unwilling subjects. Their magical creativity was substantial, though channeled in directions their mother found frustrating. They dreamed of opening a joke shop, though they lacked the capital to start a business. Ron grew up the sixth son, always wearing hand-me-downs, always compared to his successful older brothers, developing insecurities that would affect his relationships and self-perception. Ginny, the youngest and only daughter, was born into a house full of brothers who alternately protected and ignored her. She grew up hearing stories about Harry Potter, the boy who survived, the baby who defeated Voldemort. These stories shaped her childhood imagination, creating an idealized image of Harry that would complicate their eventual meeting. Arthur Weasley's fascination with Muggle objects led him to collect various items, batteries, plugs, electrical equipment, which he stored in his shed and attempted to understand. His genuine curiosity about how Muggles managed without magic was unusual in the wizarding world, where most witches and wizards were either prejudiced against Muggles or simply indifferent to them. Molly Weasley managed the household with skill born of necessity, stretching their limited budget to feed and clothe 7 children. Her magic in the kitchen was impressive. She could prepare elaborate meals with a wave of her wand. Though ingredients still cost money, they often struggled to spare. Her protectiveness of her children was fierce, bordering on smothering, perhaps intensified by having lost her brothers Fabian and Gideon in the war. The Weasleys' poverty was relative. They owned their home, Arthur had steady employment, they had enough food. But compared to families like the Malfoys, they were poor. Ron's dress robes for formal occasions would be ancient and moldy. His wand would be a hand-me-down from Charlie. His rat Scabbers, actually Peter Pettigrew, had been in the family for 12 years, far longer than rats typically lived, though no one thought this particularly odd. The family's blood traitor status made them targets of pure-blood supremacists' contempt. The Malfoys openly mocked them for their poverty and their Muggle-loving attitudes. Yet the Weasleys maintained their principles, refusing to adopt pure-blood ideology despite the social and economic costs. Arthur's position at the ministry was relatively low-level, partly because his attitudes about Muggles prevented advancement in departments controlled by pure-blood traditionalists. Neville Longbottom was raised by his grandmother Augusta after his parents' incapacitation. Augusta was strict and traditional, constantly comparing Neville to his father Frank, who had been a skilled Auror and Order of the Phoenix member. Neville's accidental magic had manifested late and weakly, causing his family to fear he might be a squib. This fear, and the constant pressure to live up to his father's legacy, crushed Neville's confidence and self-esteem. The wand Neville used was his father's, which never worked properly for him. Wands chose their wizards, and a wand that had bonded with someone else wouldn't perform as well for a different user, even a blood relative. This handicap, combined with Neville's anxiety and lack of confidence, made him appear far less talented than he actually was. His true abilities would only emerge later when he finally got a wand that chose him. Neville visited his parents at St. Mungo's regularly, though they didn't recognize him. Alice Longbottom would give him bubble gum wrappers, treating him like a stranger. Frank stared blankly, his mind too damaged to comprehend that this boy was his son. These visits were traumatic, confronting Neville repeatedly with what he had lost and what the Death Eaters had destroyed. Yet Augusta insisted on the visits, believing it was important that Neville see his parents and understand what had been done to them. Draco Malfoy grew up at Malfoy Manor, surrounded by wealth and privilege, taught that his family's pureblood status made him inherently superior. Lucius Malfoy filled his son's head with pureblood ideology, though carefully omitting details about his own Death Eater activities. Draco learned to look down on Muggle-borns, half-bloods, and blood traders. He learned that money and influence could buy almost anything, that rules applied differently to people like them. Narcissa Malfoy doted on her only child, indulging his every whim. As Bellatrix Lestrange's sister and Sirius Black's cousin, she came from the Black family's pure-blood traditions, though she lacked her sister's sadistic cruelty. Her love for Draco was genuine and fierce, perhaps her one humanizing quality in an otherwise cold character. The house elf Dobby served the Malfoy family during these years, suffering abuse and mistreatment. Lucius Malfoy treated Dobby as a servant to be used and discarded, never considering that the elf might have feelings or desires beyond service. The Malfoys' casual cruelty to Dobby reflected their general attitude toward beings they considered inferior. In Albania, in the depths of a dark forest, the remnant of Voldemort that had survived his body's destruction existed in a state between life and death. He was less than a ghost, a fragment of soul clinging to existence through the anchors of his Horcruxes. He possessed small animals, living through them briefly before they died from hosting such darkness. He waited, too weak to take physical form, too weak to return to Britain, sustained only by his Horcruxes and his will to survive. During these years, Voldemort in his disembodied form encountered various dark creatures and desperate wizards in the Albanian forests. Some stories filtered back to the magical world, rumors of strange disappearances, of travelers who entered certain parts of the forest and were never seen again, of animals found dead with no apparent cause. The Ministry dismissed these as local superstition or natural dangers. Few connected these incidents to the Dark Lord supposedly destroyed years ago. One person who remained loyal even in Voldemort's absence was Bellatrix Lestrange, imprisoned in Azkaban but never wavering in her devotion to the Dark Lord. The Dementor's presence affected her less than other prisoners, perhaps because her fanaticism provided its own kind of twisted happiness, or perhaps because she was already so damaged that the Dementors found little sanity left to destroy. Peter Pettigrew, living as Scabbers the Rat in the Weasley household, was surrounded by magic users who never suspected his true nature. He slept in Ron's dormitory at Hogwarts during the school year, privy to conversations and information about Dumbledore, the school's defenses, and countless secrets. During summers, he lived at the Burrow, listening to order of the Phoenix veterans if any visited, gathering intelligence he couldn't use but stored away. Peter's existence as a rat was both a punishment and a refuge. He was trapped in animal form most of the time, unable to enjoy human pleasures, living on scraps. Yet he was also safe, hidden, impossible to find. He had successfully framed Sirius Black for his own crimes, and everyone believed Peter Pettigrew had died heroically trying to stop the Potter's betrayer. His guilt over betraying James and Lily was real, though not strong enough to make him confess or seek redemption. The 12 years Peter spent as a rat perhaps diminished his humanity further. Living as an animal for so long, thinking animal thoughts, eating animal food, he became more rat-like in his instincts, cowardly, prone to biting when cornered, good at hiding and surviving. His human intelligence remained, but his human conscience atrophied even further. Sirius Black in Azkaban suffered torments that would have broken most wizards. The Dementors forced him to relive his worst memories, constantly James's death, which he blamed himself for suggesting Peter as secret keeper. Harry orphaned and left with the Dursleys. Peter's betrayal, the 12 Muggles killed in Peter's escape. These memories played repeatedly in his mind, stripping away hope and happiness. What kept Sirius sane when other prisoners went mad was his innocence. He knew he hadn't betrayed the Potters, hadn't killed those Muggles, hadn't deserved imprisonment. This knowledge provided an anchor that guilt-ridden prisoners lacked. Additionally, his ability to transform into a dog gave him some protection. The Dementors had difficulty sensing dog emotions, and his animal mind was simpler, less vulnerable to their effects. Sirius spent 12 years planning nothing, expecting nothing, existing in a hell of forced memories and despair. He had no trial to appeal, no legal recourse, no hope of release. The wizarding world had forgotten him or remembered him only as a traitor. His family had disowned him years before. James was dead, Lily was dead, Remus believed him guilty, and Harry, James's son, Sirius's godson, grew up not knowing Sirius existed or that he had been willing to die for Harry's parents. The injustice of Sirius's imprisonment represented the magical justice system's fundamental failures. He was sent to Azkaban without trial, without the opportunity to present evidence or testify. Barty Crouch Sr.'s policies during the post-war period prioritized quick punishment over due process, and the Wisengamot had been too frightened and angry to insist on trials for every accused Death Eater. Other innocent people likely suffered similar fates, imprisoned on suspicion or false evidence, without the chance to prove their innocence. The magical world's eagerness to move past the war meant they didn't carefully examine each case, didn't ensure that only the guilty were punished. The rush to justice produced injustice, and 12 years later no one questioned whether all the prisoners in Azkaban truly belonged there. The magical world during these 10 years slowly rebuilt, but many of the problems that had enabled Voldemort's rise remained unaddressed. Blood purity ideology persisted among many pureblood families, taught to children like Draco Malfoy as simple fact. Economic inequality kept families like the Weasleys struggling while families like the Malfoys wielded influence through wealth. The ministry remained susceptible to corruption, with positions influenced by bribes and family connections rather than merit. Educational reform never happened. Students continued learning the same curriculum that had been taught for centuries, with the same gaps in their education. They learned no Muggle studies unless they took an elective, no political theory, no critical examination of magical history or the factors that led to conflicts like the Goblin Rebellions or the rise of Dark Lords. The treatment of magical creatures remained unjust. House elves continued in slavery. Werewolves faced systematic discrimination. Goblins remained resentful of their historical treatment. Giants were hunted nearly to extinction. The centaurs stayed in their forests, wanting nothing to do with wizard society. These unresolved tensions would eventually be exploited by Voldemort when he returned. The statute of secrecy remained absolute, maintaining the separation between magical and Muggle worlds. This separation meant that magical people remained ignorant of Muggle society, technology, and culture. Arthur Weasley's fascination with Muggle objects was unusual. Most wizards couldn't understand how Muggles functioned without magic and didn't care to learn. This ignorance fed prejudice, making it easier to convince purebloods that Muggles were inferior. The lack of integration or even regular contact between magical and Muggle worlds created particular problems for Muggle-born witches and wizards. They entered the magical world at 11, leaving behind their Muggle friends and much of their Muggle education. They learned to navigate a new culture with different rules, different prejudices, different assumptions. The magical world expected them to simply adapt, providing no formal orientation beyond what Hogwarts professors chose to mention. Muggle-born students often faced mockery for not knowing things that magical children learned from birth: how to use flue powder, what a galleon was worth, which families were important. They had to learn a completely new vocabulary, new social rules, new cultural references. And they faced prejudice from purebloods who considered them inferior despite their magical abilities being equal or superior. The magical world's resistance to Muggle technology meant they missed developments that could have enhanced magical life. Electric lights were more reliable than torches or floating candles. Telephones could communicate over distances instantly without requiring owls. Muggle medical advances could complement magical healing. But wizards dismissed Muggle innovations as unnecessary when magic could accomplish similar results. This technological stagnation extended to magical innovation as well. The last major advancement in broomstick design was the Nimbus series. Potion development was slow. Spell creation was rare. The magical world seemed content with the magic they had inherited from previous generations, rarely pushing boundaries or attempting to discover new applications of magical theory. The resistance to innovation was partly cultural and partly practical. Magical society was traditionalist, valuing ancient knowledge and established methods. Innovation was viewed with suspicion. New spells might be dangerous, new potions untested, new applications of magic potentially dark. The trauma of the recent war, where dark wizards had used magic in terrible new ways, reinforced this conservatism. But practical factors also limited innovation. Magical research required funding, and there was no equivalent to Muggle universities or research grants. Private researchers funded their own work, which meant only wealthy individuals could afford to experiment. The Ministry's Department of Mysteries conducted research, but their work was secret and their findings rarely shared. Hogwarts taught existing magic but didn't emphasize magical theory or research methodology. The career path for a magical researcher was unclear and unrewarding. A wizard who wanted to develop new spells or potions would likely need another job to support themselves, conducting research in spare time. Publications like Transfiguration Today existed but had limited circulation. Recognition for magical innovation was rare, and financial rewards even rarer. This lack of magical innovation meant that the magical world's problems were solved with centuries-old methods, even when better solutions might be possible. The treatment of werewolves relied on the recently invented wolfsbane potion, but research into better treatments or even cures was limited. The healing of spell damage remained imperfect, with some injuries permanent when magical theory might enable better solutions. The political structure of the magical world remained vulnerable to manipulation and corruption. The Minister for Magic was elected, but the electoral process was never clearly explained. Whether all adult wizards could vote, how campaigns worked, what prevented vote manipulation through imperius or other means. The ministry departments answered to the minister, creating a concentration of power with few checks and balances. The Wizardry served as both legislature and high court, a combination of functions that created conflicts of interest. Members included wealthy purebloods who held hereditary seats, ensuring that old families maintained political power regardless of population shifts or changing demographics. Dumbledore's position as chief warlock gave him significant influence, but he was unusual. Most Wizardry members protected their own interests and those of their social class. The Daily Prophet's influence on public opinion was enormous, and its editorial stance could swing elections and shape policy. Yet the paper's ownership and funding sources were unclear. Rita Skeeter's sensationalist articles were obviously biased, often containing outright lies, yet there seemed to be no journalistic standards or accountability. The Prophet's relationship with the ministry was too close, with the paper often serving as a mouthpiece for official positions rather than investigating them critically. The absence of a free press, or even a competing newspaper with different perspectives, meant that public opinion could be easily manipulated. During Voldemort's first rise, the Prophet had likely downplayed the danger, not wanting to cause panic or criticize ministry failures. After his fall, the paper promoted the narrative that everything was fine, that the danger had passed, that no systemic changes were needed. The International Statute of Secrecy, while protecting magical communities from Muggle persecution, also isolated them from broader developments and perspectives. The magical world of Britain had little contact with magical communities in other countries except through formal channels. The International Confederation of Wizards, Quidditch competitions, and occasional diplomatic exchanges. This isolation meant that British magical society's problems were considered only from a British magical perspective. Other countries' approaches to house elf rights, werewolf treatment, or magical education weren't seriously examined or considered. The magical world of Britain assumed their way was the right way, that their traditions were superior to alternatives. The lack of international cooperation also meant that international dark wizards like Grindelwald could operate across borders with relative impunity until they became too large a threat to ignore. Voldemort's ambitions had been primarily focused on Britain, but had he succeeded, his movement would likely have spread internationally. The magical world had no equivalent to international criminal courts or cooperative law enforcement beyond informal agreements. The relationship between magical Britain and the Muggle British government was formally structured through the Prime Minister being informed of magical matters, but practically limited. The Muggle Prime Minister couldn't influence magical policy, could barely comprehend magical problems, and had no recourse if the magical world's actions affected Muggles. This one-way flow of information reinforced magical society's sense of superiority and independence from Muggle authority. The decade before Harry Potter's Hogwarts letter arrived was shaped by collective denial and deliberate forgetting. The magical world wanted desperately to believe that Voldemort was gone forever, that the nightmare was over, that they could return to their comfortable lives without confronting the rot at the foundation of their society. They celebrated the defeat of a symptom while ignoring the disease that had produced him. This willful blindness extended to how the war was remembered. The official narrative became simple. Voldemort was an anomaly, a uniquely evil dark wizard who had led some misguided followers astray. Once he was defeated, those followers were imprisoned or claimed to have been controlled, and everything could go back to normal. The deeper questions, why so many purebloods had supported him, what grievances he had exploited, what systemic failures had enabled his rise, were never seriously examined. The hero worship of Harry Potter fit perfectly into this narrative. A baby had somehow defeated the greatest dark wizard in history, proving that good triumphed over evil, that magic itself protected the innocent, that their world was fundamentally just. They didn't need to change anything, didn't need to address blood purity ideology or economic inequality or political corruption. They just needed to celebrate their miraculous salvation and move forward. But Harry Potter wasn't being celebrated. He was living in a cupboard, wearing oversized cast-offs, being told his parents were drunken layabouts who died in a car crash. The boy the magical world had made into a legend was being systematically broken down by his Muggle relatives, taught that he was worthless, that strange things happening around him were reasons for punishment rather than signs of power. And in the background, the pieces that would lead to Voldemort's return were slowly moving into position. Peter Pettigrew remained hidden, a living connection to the Death Eaters who might one day seek their master. Lucius Malfoy kept his dark artifacts, including a diary that contained more than just memories, though he didn't know its true nature. Bellatrix Lestrange remained fanatically loyal in her cell. The Horcruxes lay hidden, anchoring Voldemort's soul fragment to the mortal world. Dumbledore alone seemed to understand that Voldemort would return. He spent the decade preparing, researching Horcruxes, trying to understand what Voldemort had done to make himself immortal. He kept Snape close, maintaining the spy network that would be needed when war came again. He protected Harry from afar, ensuring the blood protection remained intact, though at terrible cost to the child's well-being. The magical creatures who would play roles in the coming conflict lived their lives, mostly unaware of the larger patterns. Aragog's colony grew in the Forbidden Forest. The centaurs read troubling signs in the stars but kept their interpretations to themselves. The house elves served in silence. The goblins maintained their uneasy truce with wizards while remembering their grievances. The werewolves suffered discrimination that would eventually drive some of them to Voldemort's side. The stage was set for Harry Potter's entrance into the magical world. He would arrive at Hogwarts knowing nothing of his fame, having no understanding of the history that had shaped his life, unaware of the prophecy that connected him to Voldemort. The scar on his forehead was more than a mark of survival. It was a connection to the Dark Lord who had tried to kill him, a link that would shape everything that followed. As July 31st, 1991 approached, the magical world continued its comfortable denial while Harry Potter counted down the days in his cupboard, not knowing that everything was about to change. The Dursleys had tried for nearly 11 years to stamp the magic out of him, to make him normal, to pretend he was just an ordinary boy who happened to have strange things happen around him. But magic doesn't work that way. You can suppress it, punish it, deny it, but you can't eliminate it. The Hogwarts letter would arrive soon, delivered by owls that the Dursleys couldn't escape no matter how far they ran. Hagrid would break down the door of a hut on a rock in the sea and tell Harry the truth about who he was, who his parents were, what he represented to the magical world. And Harry would step into a world where everything he'd been taught about himself was wrong, where the strange things that happened around him were signs of power rather than freakishness. But he would also step into a world unprepared for Voldemort's return, a world that had learned nothing from its recent trauma, a world where the same prejudices and problems that had enabled one Dark Lord's rise remained unaddressed and waiting to enable another. The choices made in those 10 years, imprisoning Sirius without trial, hiding Harry with abusive relatives, allowing Death Eaters to buy their freedom, sweeping systemic problems under the rug, would have consequences that shaped the Second War when it came. This is the hidden history that preceded Harry Potter's story. 1,000 years of Hogwarts tradition, decades of political corruption, years of war and trauma, and a decade of collective denial. Understanding this history helps us understand why Harry's journey mattered, why Voldemort returned, why the Second War was in many ways a continuation of the first, and why true victory would require more than simply defeating another Dark Lord. It would require confronting and changing the magical world itself, addressing the prejudices and inequalities that had festered for generations. The wizarding world had been given 10 years of peace after Voldemort's first defeat. They had wasted those years, learned nothing, changed nothing, and when the Dark Lord returned, they would pay the price for their complacency. This is the hidden history that preceded Harry Potter's story, 1,000 years of Hogwarts tradition, decades of political corruption, years of war and trauma, and a decade of collective denial. Understanding this history helps us understand why Harry's journey mattered, why Voldemort returned, why the Second War was in many ways a continuation of the first, and why true victory would require more than simply defeating another Dark Lord. It would require confronting and changing the magical world itself, addressing the prejudices and inequalities that had festered for generations. The wizarding world had been given 10 years of peace after Voldemort's first defeat. They had wasted those years, learned nothing, changed nothing, and when the Dark Lord returned, they would pay the price for their complacency. So that's the complete timeline of the Harry Potter world before the first book even begins. From the founding of Hogwarts 1,000 years ago, through Grindelwald's reign of terror, Voldemort's transformation from Tom Riddle into a Dark Lord, the First Wizarding War, and the decade of false peace that followed, all of this history shaped the world that 11-year-old Harry would enter on his 11th birthday. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of the wizarding world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more Harry Potter content. Drop a comment below telling me which part of this pre-book timeline you found most interesting, or what other aspects of Harry Potter lore you'd like me to explore in future videos.